Morning. So I'd like to thank the National Army Museum for hosting this podcast and talking about LGBT history and a really important LGBT history month for us. The LGBT community have made a huge contribution to the UK's armed forces over many, many years. And I'm incredibly sorry for the experiences that special community had, particularly when the ban was in. And it's been a real sort of learning experience for me this month, speaking to lots of different people about their experiences and how it's had really lifelong effects. And so I think where we are now is great. It's much better. We go to Pride and we're actually in the sort of top 100 employers for LGBT personnel. I'm acutely aware that whilst we can't turn back the clock, we need to do everything we can to make amends for what was clearly a discriminatory policy. I hope people have seen in the last week that you can now claim to have your medals back, and I encourage anyone to go through that, but I'm aware that's just a start and I'm always looking to do more as well. So thank you to the Army Museum for hosting this today, a really, really important conversation. I really hope it goes well.
Hello everyone and good afternoon and welcome to this virtual event brought to you by the National Army Museum. With very special thanks to the Office of Veterans Affairs and Minister Johnny Mercer for that kind introduction. 21 years ago, the ban on homosexuality in the armed forces was lifted. This event is being hosted in partnership with James Robert Moore, host and the brains behind the Passing Out the podcast, and the Army LGBT Plus Forum. Today, in this In Conversation event, we're going to explore how far the Army has come in breaking down stereotypes over the past 2 decades. And we're going to be highlighting the importance of this significant milestone and change in the British Army's history. This event will be in 2 parts. We will hear from the first 3 guests of the podcast and 2 current serving soldiers who will discuss the impact of the ban, the difference in generations, and response to those who have had their stories shared, the responses to those. But before, I'd just like to introduce a very special guest that we have with us today. Colonel Claire Phillips, CBE, joined the Army in 1995 and commissioned into the Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers before the ban on LGB personnel was lifted. Colonel Claire was the first Lieutenant Colonel and most senior officer to lead the London Pride Parade twice. On promotion to Colonel, became the REME Corps Colonel and subsequently the Colonel Career Management Operations. Soon to be Brigadier Phillips, she is the co-chair of the Army LGBT Plus network and is here to introduce the event for us today. So thank you so very much for joining us, Colonel Claire.
Nicola, thank you. It's an incredibly kind introduction. To everyone who is joining the transmission today, thank you very much for making the time on a busy Saturday to join all of us. As Nicola said, my name is Claire Phillips. My preferred pronouns are she and her, and I identify as a gay woman. First and foremost, I'd like to apologise for my COVID haircut. My wife and I received our first set of clippers on Wednesday. We experimented and it turns out we really should have read the instructions. Towards the end of last year, I had the privilege to join the Army LGBT Plus network as a co-chair. And I couldn't be more proud to be part of this element of the Army's network of diversity. The role of the network is to engage, enthuse, and inspire, because we know that as an armed force, we are better every day for our diversity. And as a network, what we're seeking to achieve is for everybody in the Army to see each other and value each other as an individual, and to inspire everybody across the Army to find out more about all of the different diversity networks. And from our perspective, that of course means the Army LGBT Plus network. We hope that by generating that shared understanding, we will inspire all of our members to go on to achieve great things in their careers. As Nicola said, we are now 21 years after the LGB ban has been lifted. And part of what you'll hear today is looking to our past. Some of what you'll also hear is looking to the future. And what is really important is that we will remember our past, remember that we all stand on the shoulders of those who went before us, whilst we look to the future, and hope that at some point in the future, there will be no need for an LGBT plus network, because we will all be able to coexist alongside each other without fear of holding hands in the street or going home to the person that we love. As a network, we're really proud of our relationship with the National Army Museum, and we think it's an incredible opportunity to contribute to the contemporary history of the Army, particularly in these quite remarkable COVID times. I hope what you'll hear today is about the transformational change of the organisation of which I'm most incredibly proud, the British Army. Within the Army, we talk about 6 core values, and I think there are 2 of those core values that I would highlight to you now that I think you'll hear the most about today. The first is a story of courage. From all of those individuals who speak to you today, I am absolutely certain that you will come away from today's event being overawed, I suspect, with the courage of those individuals that you'll hear speaking. I hope that what you'll also come away with is an understanding of the Army's desire to express our 6th core value, that of respect for others, and understanding the individuality and personality of every single member of our organisation. I suspect for some people on the call, it will be hard for you to believe 2 things. Hard for you to believe where we were, and perhaps once you understand that, hard for you to believe where we are today. But it is a story of success, and it is a story of overcoming remarkable adversity to give me and others the opportunity for the quite remarkable careers that we've been able to fulfil in the Army. The head of the British Army is the Chief of the General Staff, and he most recently observed that it is more often the subtle attitudes and comments which are thoughtless and which could pervade our culture, which will wear people down. To Précy his words, we know that it is the little big things that really matter. And we know that as members of the British Army, we must not walk past anything that we would not wish to be subjected to ourselves. So I think that brings me to the importance of this event. We know that we are all role models for everybody else who's in the Army today and for those who will follow us. I am really lucky. I've gone from having a photograph of my fake boyfriend at Sandhurst in 1995 to talking to the most senior soldier in the British Army about leading the Army's contingent at London Pride. And that means I can bring my whole self to work and talk freely about who I love and who I go home to. But I know that if you can't see it, you can't be it. And I know that if we hide our sexuality, if we hide our gender identity, we are also hiding a significant portion of ourselves. And organisations know that if you have to hide a portion of yourself, that you are consuming energy on keeping that detail concealed instead of contributing to the organisation. And therefore, to be the very best British Army that we can be, we need to allow everybody to bring their whole selves to work, to get the most from all of our people, and therefore inclusion must be at the very forefront of all of our decision making. So I'll hand back to Nicola by concluding that, as I mentioned, I know that I stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before me to generate the freedoms that I enjoy. I'm really grateful to the National Army Museum for hosting this event today, and I am so incredibly proud of all those people who will join me on the presentation. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing everybody's stories. Nicola, thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Claire. That was absolutely amazing and very inspiring words from you. And I think, as you said, and why it's important to us as a National Army Museum to be hosting a discussion like this is to ground it in that historical importance and, of course, the contemporary collecting that we're so involved in as well with the British Army, amongst many things. So shall we could I ask all but Robert and James to turn your cameras off and we can begin today's discussion. Thank you. So as I mentioned, this event is in partnership with Passing Out the podcast. And we are so thrilled to be joined by James Robert Moore, who is the chair, who's going to be chairing this afternoon's discussion. James Robert Moore is a theatres creative, director, writer, and his main passion in life is to tell queer stories authentically. And boy, do you do that very well. If you haven't already downloaded the episodes of the podcast, please do, and we'll be sharing some links later on in the chat. But James, could I first start off by asking you the question of why did you decide to make this podcast, and a little bit about the podcast itself?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Nicola. Firstly, thanks everybody for tuning in today. I keep getting a little thing popping up saying that my internet is unstable. So if I go a little bit... yeah, so I first was asked last January to come and do a talk at the National Army Museum to commemorate the 20th anniversary of the lifting of the ban. And I had been asked to come along to talk about a play that I'd written about an openly gay soldier. First of all, I felt like a massive fraud because I have no real connections to the army in any way, shape or form. And I was asked to come along and talk about this play that I had written. And I was on a panel actually with some of the people that we're going to be talking with today. And I sort of came away from it really shocked and in awe of their stories. And as Claire kind of mentioned that word, courage, because I hadn't necessarily, I'd done my research about this particular story that I'd written this play about, but suddenly here were all these other people from the LGBT plus community with these incredible stories who'd lived before the ban, lived through the ban, lived afterwards, and sort of had no real sort of recollection of it happening at all. And I sort of came away from it thinking, okay, I'm telling this sort of really singular story about one gay man, but actually there's all these other incredible stories that we just don't hear about. We don't hear these stories particularly when it's about also having a career in the army. So I've sort of said to you a few times before, Nicola, one of the main reasons why I was so fascinated about the army and queer people is because in my head, those were two things that never really went together. And I kind of talk about the fact in the introduction to each podcast episode, I sort of say that I, was, aware of what the army was, of course, when I was growing up, but it's to sort of say this isn't for someone like you, when actually now that's the complete opposite. And I sort of came away from that talk on that panel last year thinking how inclusive it now was, and almost how how welcoming it is to say, we don't care what you are, it's about whether you can do the job. And yeah, I was just so surprised and just really wanted to kind of delve in, but authentically tell those stories. So rather than me going away and doing a bit of research and then, droning on for an hour and a half about, I found this out and whatever, it's much more exciting and interesting to get people to tell what happened to them. Because if we don't get people to tell us their stories, if we don't record them, they go eventually at some point, they disappear. So it's really important, I think, to kind of get these things on record. And yeah, that's kind of how the podcast was born.
Fantastic. And I think, you mentioned that event that we done last year for the lifting of the ban and the 20 years on. And I think it was just, the standing ovation that, I've never heard applause and, seen everyone on their feet for every single person. And we go back to what Claire said, and it was that courage of them telling those stories, which is, also why we're doing this event today. So I'm going to hand over to you, James, and thank you to Robert for joining us as well today.
Thanks, Nicola. So yeah, what we're going to sort of do is have a little talk with each of the people who I interviewed in the first 3 episodes, and one of those people was Robert Ely, who is here now, and it was really great to be able to speak to Robert because I had when I was kind of looking up veterans to talk to, Robert was someone who in my research had come up, and I was thinking, how on earth am I going to find you, Robert? And then and then all of a sudden I got an email in my inbox saying, oh, I've heard you're doing this podcast. I've seen that you're looking to talk to veterans, and I'd be willing to have a conversation, which I was so thrilled with, because I was thinking, how am I going to find him? And there you were in my inbox. So thank you, Robert. Just really briefly, for those that haven't listened to Robert's story yet, which is episode 1 of Passing Out, Robert joins the army in late 1966 at the age of 17, and was then discharged in 1986 after being arrested on suspicion of being homosexual. You can sort of go into more detail with Robert's story in the episode, but he was kept under mess officer's arrest for 3 days and was interrogated, and ultimately what sort of happened then went on to affect his entire life. So Robert, I firstly wanted to start by just sort of asking you what it was actually like reliving your story for the interview.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Reliving the interview, I've listened to it a couple of times, and it's over the years I did a number of broadcast interviews, so some of it is sort of just repetitive to me, but some of the stuff, because we had time when we were doing the podcast to go into detail, it brought back people I'd forgotten about in my life, who actually I've realized now meant a lot more to me than my brain had forgotten them. And in our discussions, they were brought back to life. And some of it's been quite emotional to deal with on a personal net. But having said that, for those who have listened to the podcast, they'll understand what I'm talking about. And I do strongly advise you do get a chance to listen to it. I never saw myself as a role model. I never saw myself as an activist. And I was just thrown into it almost accidentally. But that's how I now feel people are thinking of me. And music has been my life. That's my only real interest, apart from my dog, who you may see wander across, by the way. Those are my 2 big interests in life. And music continues to be a big interest, even now I'm retired.
So, you saying there that you've never sort of seen yourself as being an activist. And yes, of course, music is your main passion. And is why you joined in the first place. But is it? Do you not see at all sort of that actually the things that you did, were helping to pave the way, were helping to, however small, you were part of that jigsaw puzzle?
Oh, absolutely, I do. Yes, yeah. I realised fairly early on when all this was. When I was starting to challenge the status quo, that what I didn't want was somebody to go through what I'd been through. Mm-hmm. And I always used to tell people that if one day we can get the ban lifted and it can be an inclusive world for people to live in, then my work will have been done.
Yeah, and that is what's happened, and is one of the reasons why we're here, being able to have even this conversation now.
Yes, but for me it's quite remarkable, obviously.
Yeah, of course. Have you sort of, in terms of the reaction that we have had, particularly to your episode, from lots of people, has been one of shock. With some of the things that happened to you, and some of the the interrogation questions that were asked of you, we've had quite a few people sort of surprised that even happened. Has obviously you have lived it, and family and friends that are close to you will know that. But have you sort of had any reactions or responses that you sort of didn't quite expect?
I've been surprised at the amount of positive reaction there's been, which is obviously very welcome there, because that is completely different from the world that I was born into. And it's great to hear people saying that you've had some effect on their thinking, you know.
Mm-hmm. And that was one of the reasons why, you know, I think it's so important, and we discussed a lot that if we don't hear your story, if we don't listen to your story, then we can't, you know, we can't truly appreciate what it is that we have now, and we'd be very wrong to ignore what happened to you.
Yes.
Sort of when we were arriving today, just sort of before we went live, and there we were kind of in the Zoom room with all the other currently serving soldiers. Is there, I remember you saying in your interview, there's a part of you who sort of still dreams and wakes up that you've got to get to work and all things like this.
That's there every day.
How sort of was it?
Don't know. I'm now in my 70s, and I still think about what my career was 30 or 40 years ago. You know, still matters.
Of course it does. How does it feel sort of being in a room with people that are here in uniform and that sort of thing? Does it sort of feel like everything just sort of clicks back in your brain again?
Yes, it does in some respects. The nice thing is that I don't have to bounce scrape anymore.
Great. Well, thanks, Robert. We're going to keep kind of chatting as this event goes along.
Mm-hmm.
Just thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it's a really brilliantly eloquent interview that you gave, and has given, as you said, lots of people food for thought. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. I just, you know, for me personally, being able to spend time talking to you on the phone, and then, you know, the 2 hours we had in the studio was just really, really eye-opening. So thank you so much, and thank you for coming today.
Welcome.
But what we're going to do now, we'll say thank you to Robert for now, and we'll see him again really super shortly. But now what I'd like to do is introduce Warrant Officer Class 2 Deborah Penny. So Debs, if you want to pop your camera on, that would be fab. And there she is. And Debs was episode 2 of our podcast. So just really, really quickly, again, for people who haven't listened yet, Debs joined the Army in 1982 at the age of 16 and came out to friends and family as transgender in 2004. She finished her regular career in 2018 to join the reserves, and is also now a warrant officer in the diversity engagement team. So hello, Debs.
Hi, James, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm well, and thank you very much for having us on today. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into this group.
No, thank you for talking to me again. I just wanted to sort of thank you really, because I have had so many really interesting conversations with friends and family who have listened to your episode, and our sexuality and gender, and you've sort of, you know, thank you for continuing to open up that conversation and for providing a sort of springboard for people to ask those important questions, because I think, kind of similarly to what Claire said at the beginning, if people aren't visible, then, you know, they don't know what to think, to expect, and they don't know how to ask those questions. How did it feel for you listening back to the episode?
Actually, very strange. Obviously, having lived it, then recounting it. It was strange looking back at some of the stuff that I said, and then remembering like little incidences and other things flowed out from that. So it was actually very, very strange listening back to the podcast. I'm glad I did it. I just find it very strange looking back at my life again, wondering what could, maybe if times had been different, whether it had been a different story and that sort of thing. But I'm glad it's opened up questions and for people to start asking those probably problematic questions that maybe they would never have asked before. So yeah, I'm I'm glad it's helped out a lot.
When you sort of, listening back to it's your whole entire, life story up until that point that we had the interview condensed into like 57 minutes, which is madness. Is there anything sort of when you did listen back, is there anything that sort of stood out or sort of shone a little bit more than you'd sort of necessarily thought about before?
Well, to be fair, the one thing that does stand out for me, and I think it always will, was the day I marched at London Pride for the first time in uniform. That for me was one of the biggest days of my life. To be in uniform at London Pride with everybody else, it's one of those days, one of those experiences that you can't relive, and I thought would never happen in my whole life to be able to do that. And that's such a big event for me. There's lots of other little pieces, there's other big pieces in there, but for me to be actually there at London, marching down that street, like, was just it just one of those big days.
It's such a beautiful kind of description the way you about it in the episode as well, and we both mentioned how sad we were that it didn't happen last year. But there's just been that announcement that all being well, it should be taking place in September, so fingers crossed it is. How is everything going in the diversity engagement team?
It's a new challenge. I'm looking forward to taking it out on the road. The idea behind it is to dispel the myths. So, as Colonel Phillips said, want to go out there and explain to people that this is not the old-fashioned army, that diversity and inclusion is the army, one of the army's priorities, that I want to show that you can be LGBTQ+ in the service, and I want to dispel those myths, and having in part of that army diversity engagement team will allow me to do that, and we'll be able to get the word out. So I'm really looking forward to it. Presentations are drafted. I'm really looking forward to getting out there when we can.
Oh, great. Good luck with it. I think, any sort of anything about being visible is the best way. If people see and people get the opportunity to talk and understand, any of those prejudices are, answered and dispelled. So yeah, good luck with it all. It's a great thing that you're doing, and I can't wait to hear more about it.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Thanks, Debs. Similarly to Robert, we're going to talk to you again in a little bit. But what we're going to do now is introduce you to the third episode guest that we spoke to, and that was Staff Sergeant Guy Lowe-Barrow MBE. So Guy, if you want to pop your camera on, that whole thing. For those of you who haven't yet listened to Guy's episode, again, another little quick introduction. Guy grew up in St Vincent and the Grenadines and joined the army in 2001, so a year after the ban had been lifted. And of the ban being lifted, Guy says that was sort of one of the biggest reasons why he joined the army and moved to the UK, because he read that in order to live a fuller life, he would have to leave his home country. Guy, thank you for being with us today. What was it like for you hearing your podcast episode? Did anything sort of surprise you about what you spoke about?
Firstly, thank you very much for having me. And if I can just say thank you, Robert, for the amazing podcast that he really did set the scene. Listening back it's been a journey of sorts. It's sort of taking me back through so many things that I guess we're too busy with life to sort of go through every day, and ever so often you take stock and listening to the podcast and actually hearing myself say these things and recount experiences. It did two things. It made me very reflective and in effect sad that some of these things had happened, but also quite appreciative of where I am and the experiences, both positive and not so positive, and also to be, again, really thankful for where I am as a person and as a soldier.
What when you were growing up, could you ever envisage that you would be able to be so vocal about LGBT plus rights and being so visible as a role model, you know, in all the work that you've done within your career?
Certainly, I don't think that one could I could have seen myself being described as you described me, because it's not how I see myself. I see myself as a guy living his life and trying to make a way in the world and a space for him, and make that space better for him and people who come after him. So I don't really identify as being a role model. I just try and live the best life that I can to make sure that I am paying it forward for those who paid it forward for me.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think it's so important for these, you know, Robert's story, Deb's story, your story, they're all very different. They all have lots of, you know, similar themes and sort of similar feelings that you and experiences that you went through. But obviously Robert's was, you know, before the ban was lifted, Deb's was sort of before, during and after, and then you joined in 2001. Why do you think it's so important for us to hear all three of these different experiences being told?
I think in one word, context. So
Yeah.
Firstly, community is the thing that binds us together, and so we have similarities that we share. The context then gives us an amazing array that adds to our understanding of where we are, how we got there, and why we should be watchful of ensuring that these rights are maintained, and certainly making sure that we don't take them for granted. So yeah, for me, I think what it does as well, it gives depth to the LGBT plus experience. The community is so varied that we do need varied stories from different times, and in particular in the Army, the military's case, it is important to have on file a living memory, or a memory that passed through, that is catalogued and kept in memory of where we've come from, what the hurdles were. Because from my personal experience, when I was in training and somebody actually told me the experiences of those who came before me, I was really shocked, and it made me really take stock and really want to be here and be appreciative of the then opportunities and freedoms that I had, and was really thankful for those. So it gives context, and it certainly builds the foundation for our future within this organization, and also our future within the community, LGBT wise, and larger community of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, and Northern Ireland.
Amazing. Thanks so much, Guy, and again, thank you for telling your story. I'm super proud to have all three of those alongside each other. So thank you very much. And we're gonna speak with you again, similarly to Debs and Robert, in a little bit. So thank you. What I'm going to do now is introduce two new people who we didn't have on the podcast, but I'm super thrilled to be able to speak with them today. So I'd like to introduce Sapper Cameron Chilton and Corporal Rhona Carse, who are joining us today as well. So thank you both for being here. First of all, just we'll start with Cameron. So Cameron joined the Army in 2018 at the age of 16. Cameron identifies as bisexual, but told me that his sexuality, gender identity never made him doubt that he could have a career in the Army. So Cameron, with that in mind, sort of, how does that make you feel when you hear Robert's story, who, you know, only a few decades ago had such a completely different experience to the one that you had?
So obviously, I remember having this question before on another brief, but it makes me see that how much the Army has changed, because obviously since I joined, It took me a year to come out, but when I did come out, I never had, any backlash from it. Hearing that other people had, discrimination, you get locked up, you obviously get put into the warrant officer's mess and basically interrogated. From hearing that and hearing how it is now, it makes me glad to know that everyone's now included into the army, and means that I can be myself and not be feared, and not fear that my career and my livelihood will be ripped from underneath me and just kind of kick me from the army.
Yeah, I was gonna. Great. I mean, that's sort of what I imagined that you would say. And one of when I sort of sent both you and Rhona a little bit to fill out before we had this chat, which is what I sent to the other three before we did their podcast interviews. One of my favourite answers to a question was from you, Cameron, that I asked, how old were you on the 12th of January 2000 when the ban was lifted? And you replied, I wasn't born, which makes me feel incredibly old. But to sort of know that up until the year, I know you weren't born, but the year 2000 was only 21 years ago, that up until that point, you wouldn't be able to be out and proud. What does that sort of make you feel?
I honestly don't know. So obviously, with me not knowing in general how it was beforehand, and the only person I can really ask was my dad, but he's obviously straight and he was in the army beforehand. I can honestly say that it would have made me nervous if I wanted to join the army back then. And obviously, if I was a bit older and I was joining the army back when Guy joined the army, I can probably say I'd be a bit nervous about coming out because obviously the whole stigma would still be there. And it still has been there it was still there for a couple of years after it came out, and it slowly, gradually got better. Hearing my mates who have said that they also joined a couple of years after the ban and said they had a few, issues. No one really cares anymore. It's just kind of a bit, sometimes some people are a bit pushy about it, but others aren't. I've never really had any issues, so I can't really say how I think I'd feel, to be fair.
Mm-hmm. No, I understand that. So you're the LGBT champion for your regiment. So what does that mean? Tell me what that entails.
So it's just like a figurehead for the regiment. So if anyone, it's a hard job to do because obviously not hard in the sense of I've got a lot to do, but it's basically someone that if someone isn't out or they want someone to speak to, they could come to me. Whereas, I can't do any of the tea events or anything like that because if, let's have a coffee morning in the food hall or anything like that, because obviously if you have a bunch of people that aren't out or people that are out but are kind of like I've got a boyfriend and then that's it, they don't really talk about it much more. They don't want to go to a coffee morning and be labelled as something or have people going, oh, he wants a bit of extra, attention because he likes men, etc. So it's more of a person there that if someone isn't out and they're in their regiment or having a bit of issues, just to maybe chat to, I don't know, if they want to, or just someone there to know that there's help out there.
It's just like a real sort of supportive role that your door is always kind of open for them to chat to.
Yeah, I'd say so. Yeah.
That's great. Thanks, Cameron. And Rhona, you joined the army in 2014 at the age of 24. You identify as pansexual, although you said to me that you usually say bisexual to keep things a little simple. First of all, what just because there will be some people who will go, what does that mean? To you, what does it mean to be pansexual?
Can I just check is my Wi-Fi cooperating before I start?
Oh, I can hear you perfectly, Rhona. Perfect.
Brilliant. Well, in terms of terminology, I don't really get offended at much. I think because I'm married to a woman, quite often I'll get labelled as gay or lesbian, which is fine. If it's not relevant to the conversation, I'll probably just move on. I think there's a couple of reasons that I struggle with the term bisexual. I think it's often associated with negative connotations. I think words like greedy, undecided, confused, it's often used in particular when you're talking about young bisexuals. And I think it's often thought of as like the training wheels for later becoming gay. And I think that attitude really has to stop. But at the root of it, I think bisexual means two. People think you're attracted to masculine men or feminine women, and it's as simple as that. And they often assume that there's a 50-50 split, so you're equally attracted to both, which is certainly not my experience. So I think the term pansexual incorporates an idea that's a little less binary. I think that the men that I'm usually attracted to exhibit more what we would call feminine traits stereotypically. So for example, men that wear makeup, I love that. I think androgyny is very attractive. And it's crazy to me that people would think that like John Wayne and David Bowie, for example, are the same gender just because they were born with the same body parts. So for me, pansexual is acknowledging that gender is perhaps a little more complex than recent history would suggest. And it's acknowledging that gender and body parts are completely different things. And I think it's a term that allows people to like who they like without pigeonholing a type as such, if that makes sense.
No, perfect sense. Thanks, Rhona. That's a really, really eloquent way of putting all that. So thank you. Similarly to Cameron, when I asked if your sexuality or gender identity had ever made you doubt whether a career in the army would be viable for you, you said absolutely not. So yeah, talk to me a little bit about that.
Perhaps ignorance, to be honest. I grew up with very open-minded parents, very open-minded friends. I went to music college where you can't swing a bag of cats without hitting a gay. So I think the army in this echo chamber of positivity and echo chamber of privilege as well. So it just never occurred to me that LGBT people couldn't have any job that they wanted. Really didn't.
It's amazing. It's and just sort of hearing both of you talk about labels is, I mean, I'm you know, not that many years older than you both, but there's still, you know, labels are still such a thing that sort of gently seems to be with kind of each slightly younger generation. Labels are kind of getting, you know, it's much of a muchness now. It doesn't really matter. So it's really interesting hearing you both kind of talk about that. How do you, or Rhona, how do you feel sort of, you know, you said you've never hidden your sexuality and for the most part people didn't, you know, really care. How do you feel sort of having listened to the podcast episodes, listening to Robert, Debs and Guy when they've all had sort of various points in their career and lives where they've been really conflicted with their identities and their careers and have had, you know, negative experiences, sort of again, kind of like what I asked Cameron, sort of what do you feel when you hear that things were so very different for them?
I think I've got mixed feelings. I think that the fact that I don't share those experiences, it's a real testament to progress. So in that sense, that I'm lucky. But I think it's really important to acknowledge that I'm white, I'm middle class, I'm British. So I'm very conscious not to share my experience as the new norm. I think there's a lot of challenges for people that are still double, triple minorities, people that are Black, people that are trans. They're, you know, I'm not going to speak on behalf of other people. But mostly I think it's important to follow the example of people like Robert. I think it makes me really determined to start where they finished. There's a huge difference between being LGBT and being an activist. And I think it gives me that sense of duty to be an activist and not just sort of ride the coattails of people that went before me in the community. So I guess in answer to your question, it makes me feel lucky, it makes me feel outraged, it makes me feel motivated, sort of all at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you both. What I'd love to do now is you two stay here, and Robert, Debs and Guy, if you want to pop your cameras back on, just so we can kind of start to widen this conversation out. Robert, if I can sort of just bring you into this first.
Yeah.
Hearing sort of Rhona and Cameron then with their experiences, I mean, that's, you know, a change from what happened with you and what we spoke about. Sort of what sort of springs out for you?
Two things really. One is, and it's great to hear their stories, which are so different to mine and others like myself. And obviously, I'm proud that they can do what they wish to do without any baggage, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
the other thing is that, and this sort of takes me right back to my young days, is nowadays people talk about diversity a lot. There was no such discussion back in the 1950s. And at that time, you know, everything was black and white. And I don't mean that in skin color, but I mean literally, you know, rules, governmental rules. So whether you were gay, you couldn't be gay, it was illegal. It wasn't just the forces, it was in the 50s. If you were gay, you stood the chance of being arrested and losing your whatever career you wanted to do. Mm-hmm. The forces back in when the first ban was lifted in was it 67, changed things for civilians, but it didn't change people in forces life. And it's taken a long while, right through, as you say, to 2000, before the forces sort of joined the civilian world. But now the armed forces are, and I'm proud to hear that, you know, they are champions in diversity in a lot of ways. I'm not saying it's perfect, but the world has changed so much. And it's because of things like myself and other people in different areas stood up and tried to be counted. And I think that's important.
Yeah, it is. Sort of touching a little bit on what Robert said there, Debs, if I can come to you, attitudes clearly have changed really significantly within the army in, you know, 20 years, 21 years now. Do you, obviously the ban on homosexuality in the UK was lifted first, but then it remained illegal within the army. So then the army have kind of had to play catch up in the last sort of 20 years. Do you think that the changes that have happened sort of are reflected in the civilian world too now? Does it feel sort of quite equal?
I think, to be fair, I think the army is actually slightly ahead of society. From what I understand of the last batch of stats, I think it's 1 in 5 LGBTQ plus persons still suffers harassment. And so there's still problems out there. I know lesbian friends that don't hold hands in big towns because they don't want to suffer verbal or physical abuse late at night if they're going out to a club or something. So I think there are still problems out there for the community, and we do need people out there, advocates, people fighting for change. And the army, I think, is being one of the Stonewall Top 100s, is trying to show that we lead the field. And if we can do it, then other groups can do it, and other companies can do it, and that sort of thing. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of work to do, but the army is getting there, and hopefully we can be seen to be a shining beacon for others.
Thanks, Debs. Guy, if I can come to you, it must, or not it must, does it fill you with a kind of sense of pride to see, you know, Cameron and Rhona standing where you once stood fairly, you know, early on in your career? What do you think generations of you know, your generation of soldiers can learn from sort of the newer recruits, the newer intake?
So I'm cautiously optimistic about where we are. You know, taking everything into consideration. Certainly, when I look at Cameron and I look at Rhona and I hear their stories and I interact with people from their generation, it fills me with lots of hope and joy that for the most part, their experiences differ vastly from my own. It is definitely a sign of growth and change for the better that they're there. But there's always the caution that needs to be added, that we can't be too flippant about where we are, because all it takes is for it to go to live in memory, and then we perhaps get back to a stage where we didn't learn from our past and we relive it, as it were. But yeah, I'm extremely happy and proud. And, you know, I am amazed. You know, I certainly didn't grow up at a time where, in the times of Robert's time, but I do have some hang-ups from growing up with certain limitations being placed on me. And so I'm just really enthused and happy for them and all them.
Cameron and Rhona, do you feel a sense of understanding and kind of solidarity when you sort of hear these stories and hear about sort of the difficulties that queer people have faced, you know, before the ban was lifted or during or just after, or is it sort of not really something that, you know, you necessarily have to think about, which is no bad thing. I just sort of wonder how kind of prevalent that is to you.
I think for me, like I say, it feels marching in pride, being an activist, being involved with the network, because of what's gone before me, feels like a sense of duty. But there's an awful lot of LGBT people that just want to get their head down and get on with their life, and that's absolutely fine as well. And I think that the fact that we have that choice today is what's relevant. It's amazing that people can be so nonchalant about it.
So I wish I could understand, you know, how people used to be back before. Obviously, I can't get involved in any of the Pride events. I haven't been able to yet, but I can get involved in them as much as I can. But obviously, none are going ahead because of COVID. I've not really had to think about it much before, I don't believe. But I try and understand it as best I can, really. I think that's...
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I think it's not about, you know, nobody now needs to sort of punish themselves for the things that happened. We need to sort of be living out and proud, because that's the only way that we do continue to kind of keep the change coming. Also, I just sort of finally, just to kind of round up this little part of it, what, from all of you, what do you sort of think or hope that army life or civilian life will kind of look like within the next, you know, 10, 20, however many years for queer people?
Perhaps if I give you an answer to start with, and that is my first thought is it's a massive change over a small number of years in reality. You know, in the life cycle of the world, it's been a massive change, but it's such a positive situation at the moment that I think it's vitally important that the armed forces continue to show how positive role models can actually affect life in general, and more importantly, the armed forces link to other countries all around the world. And there's a lot of countries that don't have the freedoms that we do at the moment. And by using our experiences, perhaps we can start to improve diversity in a worldwide sense.
Great.
Is that too political?
No, I totally understand what you mean. Guy, anything sort of, what are your sort of hopes?
So for me, it's about intersectionality. I think where the army is concerned for the LGBT plus diversity strand, they're hitting the points where they need to hit them. I would like to, and I hope that we would start exploring the idea of non-binary people and that scale, but also our intersectionalities. At the moment, we are looking at people through the prism of being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. But are we really, you know, we're getting there, but we need to sort of be a little bit more proactive and a little bit more holistic in the management of the whole person. You know, so my hope is that that's where we are. We're going to end up in a place where all these issues are being addressed. I'm very much pleased with the direction of travel at the moment. As for what the LGBT community is going to be looking like in 10 years' time, it depends on the political currents of the day, as we know. So we pray and we hope that, you know, we're able to sustain and maintain the progresses that have been made and will continue to be made, hopefully. Without something else.
No, great. Thank you all so much. And in a second, I think Nicola's going to rejoin us. And if anyone's got anyone watching, if you've got any questions, you have a little opportunity now to kind of type some questions in. I think a box. I'm not sure, and things will pop up. But just to say, thank you to all of you for taking the time out and for telling your stories. And hopefully, Cameron and Rhona, fingers crossed, when all of this madness has ended, we might be able to have a bigger, more in-depth chat for the podcast, which would be amazing, and keep getting these stories down, because if, as I kind of said at the beginning to Nicola, these stories are really vital to be told and recorded and logged, because otherwise, we won't remember the things that happened before, and we don't have the context to sort of understand how we've got to where we are now, and not just in relation to the army. I think all of your stories are also, touching on, as we've said, the political, the social landscape of the time, which is really important for us all to understand. And if we don't listen, if we don't appreciate, and if we don't remember, then we're doing all of that that's come before us a huge disservice. So thank you for telling your stories, and long may all of that continue. Thanks, Nicola.
Completely, James. I couldn't agree with you more. And I'd just like to express my thanks for your thoughts, for you sharing your thoughts and experiences and opinions with us today. It has been such an honour to hear from you all, honestly. And I think it's that real contrast between listening to Robert and Cameron and, hearing those differences and how far we've come in the army as well. We do have some audience questions coming through, so I am going to fire away on a few of them just to start off with. And if I can ask you, James, first, because we've been putting the others under the spotlight a little bit. Now it's your turn, James, which I'm sure you'll thank me for. I suppose I just wanted to unpick a little bit of what you said in the start about that surprise feeling that you felt of how diverse the army was when you first came across being on the panel last year and researching for this podcast. So coming from a civilian world in particular, what struck you the most about the experiences of LGBT personnel? And I suppose my question is for both pre the ban and today.
Well, I mean, firstly, when I came along to that talk last year, I sort of, the fact that the army had an LGBT network was really surprising to me, because it's not. I sort of can't recall anywhere that I know or have worked or have been a part of that's had an LGBT network or had a visible something for people to go and talk to, and in a way, hearing that there was that support network there, and sort of, as Cameron was saying, that he's that person for his regiment that they can go and talk to, this sort of made me be like, do I want to join the army because I want to have a nice support network around me? I'm terrible, so I won't. But it's I think it's this sense of community that is really massively important, that I have with my friends, but to have in the workplace. And I know lots of workplaces now do have those kind of setups, but they're taking their time to get there. But one of the things, I mean, I didn't even know there was a ban. I didn't even know the ban had been lifted, and I didn't know that ban had only been lifted in the year 2000, which I can remember counting down the millennium coming in. And the fact that at that time I wasn't out, I can't remember how old I was, like 11 or something at that point. So, I don't, to sort of have been alive in a time where this was illegal it feels very, very alien and a bit strange. So for me, it was a whole education, because talking to Robert, to Guy, to Debs, I wasn't aware of any of those things that they'd sort of had to go through in their varying stories, because these aren't stories that we tend to hear, and I don't really know why, because I think they're really necessary, as I've said, but I sort of couldn't pinpoint one thing, Nicola, I think, that was like sort of so surprising, because I actually just think the whole thing is surprising. And what I've really enjoyed about this podcast being out there and these stories being out there is that people have got in contact that I know, that I don't know, to just sort of go, oh my goodness, I didn't know that any of this had happened. I wasn't aware of it. Because we do ignore, unless you're sort of really highly political, some things do kind of go by the by because, there's a lot happening all the time. So I just, really was in awe of everything that had kind of happened.
Completely. Let me just go back onto, sorry, I'm working off two different screens. A question for anyone, so do just raise your hand and chip in. Claire has asked, do you think that there is a duty of care for employees' mental well-being in society in general, but specifically by the MOD, that has come hand in hand with greater support for the LGBT plus community? Debs?
I think yes, because mental health, especially for LGBTQ plus people, is very important. When I came out, I had the support of the Defence Mental Health and the support of the network. And without their support, I probably wouldn't have had the journey that I had. So mental health is really important, and mental health support is very high up on that list. Yes.
Can I also add that Debs has a photograph up in the National Army Museum. You had a portrait taken by Rory Lewis's photography project, and Debs's photo is in what we call the Foyle Centre, which is our learning and educational rooms at the National Army Museum. So when we do reopen, you can all come and see Debs's portrait on up at the National Army Museum as well. Thought I'd get that in there, Debs. Another question that's come in from the public asks, what advice would you give to LGBT plus people joining the army today? And if I could maybe put that to Robert first, and then to Cameron and Rhona.
Well, obviously I'm slightly biased because I've still got those pangs of what happened, but these days armed services are great careers, and now you can follow that career to its natural end if you wish to, and you've got the talents that you want to give to the armed forces. So from my point of view, nowadays, go for it.
Cameron?
So some advice I'd say is, if you're joining the army as LGBT, it's not a case of you're forced to come out. You don't have to come out. Take it at your own time, and when you're ready to come out and tell your peers, go for it. Obviously, some people are very scared, like I was. It took me a year because I was afraid of rejection. Obviously, when I was with my partner, I saw how he was with his mates at his unit when he was out, and it kind of gave me the impression that I was safe to come out and just go for it. And obviously I had very good feedback from it. Well, I say feedback, but I didn't get any people going, oh, he's different, because they didn't see
support.
Yeah, the whole support. So if you're going to come out, take it at your own pace, and when you're ready to obviously come out.
Thank you. Rhona, do you want to add anything else, or?
Just that I think that the army is actually, I wouldn't say that homophobia or hatred is completely eradicated in the army. I'm not going to sit here and say that. I think that would be false news. But the system that we have in place is far superior to an awful lot of other employers. I have absolute faith that my boss has my back, that my chain of command are there to support me, and there is a complaint service that is very effective, that it is in place if you were ever to face discrimination, which I don't think that an awful lot of other employers have. So I would say that is one area where I would sing the praises of the army.
Thank you. I'm just going to readmit Debs before I ask the next question.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. Welcome back.
I lost the internet. Sorry.
That's fine. We're doing well so far, aren't we? Could I ask another question? And it's something that came up before when we had this discussion, and it's, what is it like serving in states where the laws prohibiting same-sex relationships, where it is still prohibited? So I suppose, have any of you served in those situations, and what is it like? No? No one?
So I had a period where for 6 months or so, I was in Belize. So I spent 6 months in Belize, and I subsequently went back. And up until recently, like my home country, it's very much it's quite similar. So the first stint in Belize was in 2007. And so there wasn't much guidance. Nobody sort of really thought about it. Subsequently going back, you know, I was part of the LGBT network, so I always felt like I had the support if I needed it. I'm very much aware, I'm not sure if Colonel Claire is on the line and would be able to elaborate a little bit, but certainly I think the Army is sort of taking note of that and have put stuff in place so that there are guidance that hopefully when you go out, you're able to get a little bit of an information on it, and so on and so forth. And yeah, that's where we are at the moment.
No, it's good to know. Another question that has come up is, what is one thing people can do better to support their LGBT colleagues?
I think it's got to be about showing that there is support first and foremost, and being able to provide a space for people to be able to talk about something that is affecting them, and not fear that there's going to be any judgment there. Again, similarly to sort of the thing that Cameron says that he does, it's, you know, having someone there that you can go and talk to about anything, and know that there's no judgment, no kind of expectations there. So I think it's just about allowing people to have a space where they will know that there is always going to be somebody there for them, which another thing actually, when I came to be on that panel last year with Guy and Debs, was the fact that I think it was Hamish, I think was his name, who was like a straight ally, which to me, I was like, what on earth? Because I've never sort of, I'd heard that term, but to have someone there who is straight, but is going, I'm going to listen and understand, and it's my job to stand up for you just as much as it, it can't always be that minority fighting for themselves. They've got to have a hand up from the majority. So I think to support your colleagues, your workers, it's about giving them the space, giving them the understanding, and listening to what it is that they need and want, I think.
Completely. No, I completely agree with you. Another question that's come in from the public, and there's no name, but I think it's a really great question. And this is to anyone, what is your opinion on the idea of the LGBT plus flag becoming a public image for supporting the NHS through this pandemic? So I suppose it's that idea of the rainbow flag now representing.
Well, a rainbow is a rainbow, and yes, obviously it's always represented pride to an extent. I think we now have this brilliant new design of the inclusive rainbow flag, which I think is great because it encompasses a lot more than that kind of regular rainbow flag does. It's hard because I feel like the queer community has, copyright on the rainbow, but the fact that we now have this more inclusive one, I think, is much more the way sort of forward to go, and sort of wouldn't want to conflate all of that too much, I think.
Does anyone else have any other remarks? No? can I ask what people's opinions are about a question that's coming from the public about the medals and the fact that you can now apply for your medals? So any thoughts or feelings, opinions?
I think it's a brilliant idea and a really good gesture. Perhaps, again, it's about, rather than having people apply, maybe doing it automatically. So there seems to be a process where you need to apply to have something given back to you, whereas if it's just automatic, you apply to say, this is where I am, and it's sent out as opposed to going through a process. It adds a little bit more value. And I have certainly seen a few people online talk about having now to go through a process again, after having gone through several. So, brilliant concept, really happy that that is there. And it definitely shows that the powers that be are thinking about it and looking to redress issues. But yeah, so yeah, good.
Colonel Claire, would you like to join in on the discussion?
It was just to say, I think we all appreciate it. It's just the medals is the beginning of a story. So there's a wonderful charity called Fighting with Pride that is existing to support military veterans from all three services. One of the things they have done recently is work really hard with the Office of Veteran Affairs to come to the point now where there is a process in place to enable people to regain any medals that were lost. I think we would all agree that's only part of the story, and it's only the very beginning. And Guy is absolutely right. It would be wonderful just simply to be able to go to people and say, we're really sorry. The difficulty, of course, is so much time has passed that we don't know where those people are. And so much information has been lost in the midst of time that the need for there to be a process to apply is not in any way to create an inconvenience for people, but we don't have another mechanism of going back out to those individuals because we don't know where they are, which is such a shame. So I'm really excited. I think I reflect on the last time I marched at London Pride, and I've got a vision for what perhaps the network could do in future years. And wouldn't it be incredible for those of us who are serving now to be in our dress uniform with our medals, marching alongside our counterparts who now have their medals again. And that would be the kind of thing that would make the hair in the, even though I haven't got any just now, but the hair in the back of your neck stand on end. And I think that would be just the most incredible story.
Robert, we'll have to get you there as well.
You're right. In fact, Robert can be given the words of command as a bandy.
Oh my goodness me.
What an honour that would be.
By pure coincidence, I printed off the request for the medals yesterday, because I'm looking into it myself because I don't have mine anymore. Although, to be fair, the Armed Forces didn't take them off me. I went through such a terrible time when I lost my house and all that sort of stuff that I threw them away in a fit of pique one day. And I'm not totally sure whether I'll be eligible to get them. So that this will be a quite nice little test case, I think.
Hey, Robert, we'd love to help you with that.
Thank you.
Completely. And I think, you had every right to throw them away in the fit of rage that you were at the time. And everyone, please do listen.
I only had two. One was for serving in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. The other one was long service and good conduct, which I always thought was quite ironic.
Well, every medal counts, no matter what they are and how many you have. You've got more than me. And actually, it was funny listening to James talk about joining the army, as it's something that everyone always says to me, working within this community for how long I have now. It's quite interesting. But just, I suppose, to close up on this event, it has been absolutely amazing to hear from all of you and the courage that you have all shared in sharing these important stories. I think, for James, for creating this podcast and continuing to collect and collate these stories, and for us as a museum to continue being a place to host these open conversations about the importance of our history, shows, how far the British Army has come in a very short space of time, in 21 years. So for James, for those people who want to listen to the podcast, we do have a link on the page at the moment. But for those that are listening and haven't got access to the link, where can they find your podcast?
You can find us on Spotify, or you can find us on the iTunes podcast app, or anywhere else where you would find your podcasts, really. And we're on Twitter and Instagram, Passing Out Podcast, so you can find us on there, and then there's links as well if you can't find it. But please do listen, and hopefully we'll be able to bring you some more as soon as we can.
Do we know how? Do you have another episode being launched shortly, or
we have people lined up, but it's just a case of waiting until we're kind of allowed. And also, if anybody wants to get in touch and give us a little bit of funding to help us make them, then please do. But yeah, I'm determined to. The response has been so great. I think it would be very remiss to not continue getting these down. So yeah, fingers crossed you will see some more soon.
Well, thank you to each and every one of you on the screen for taking part in today's discussion. And for those behind the scenes, Jamie, who co-chairs the Army LGBT Forum with Claire, has put a great deal of work into this. So thank you for him, for all of his organisation. And thank you to Isabel, who has kept us online, running all of the technology behind the scenes. We're grateful for you for live broadcasting us today. But if I could ask you to give everyone a virtual round of applause from your living rooms, and we hope to see you very soon once the National Army Museum reopens. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye.